Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Welcome to Kinda Murdery. I am your host, Zevin Odelberg, and I am excited that you are here because I am geeked for this final chapter of Who Killed Carmen Wagner. So if you haven't heard parts 1 and 2 yet, please go back and listen to them and then rejoin us. And if you have, then it's time to rock and roll. No, that's not right. You know the line. It is time to make like beloved Eddie Munson and heavy metal. Kinda Murdery starts now. As always, I'll rewind the story just a little bit to allow you to sink back into the narrative. This time, we're rewinding to Kenneth Walford's testimony as he explains to the district attorney why it is that he suspects Jack Ryan. "I saw the tracks of Ryan's horse in that neighborhood," the youth said. "The tracks could be seen plainly, although I never saw Ryan, who said he was in a different part of the country when we were searching. I know the tracks were made by his horse because he rode a colt which had not been shod, and the right front foot made a peculiar large track. These strange tracks had been made by the horse going in 2 directions, and some of them led into a box canyon, which Ryan told me had been thoroughly searched out. The colt had recently been broken, but still maintained many of its wild bucking habits. Remember this fact." A great amount of evidence was presented against David and Ryan at the preliminary hearing on the murder charges. It seemed that the case made by the state was sufficiently damning, but of course, both accused men also had their opportunity to tell their side of the case through their attorneys. But could David give a logical, convincing explanation of the terrible claw-like scratches on his face? The scratches which appeared to have been inflicted by Carmen Wagner in her attempt to escape a fate worse than death? And could Ryan explain how his coat had been soaked by blood, which appeared to have every indication of having been shed by a human being? And how could he explain the girl's watch being in his chaps? The district attorney almost felt smug. It seemed as though the conviction was in the bag, when suddenly the court hearing took a turn as the 2 half-brothers offered their startling alibis. David's attorney quickly called Gilbert Sutherland and Charles Grisbach as the chief witnesses to establish an unshakable alibi. Both witnesses declared positively under oath that David had been attacked and terribly beaten and scratched on his face during a furious fight with Henry Cox. "We were on a fishing trip, myself, Charlie Grisbach, and Henry Cox of Bridgeville," said Sutherland after he had been sworn in as a defense witness. "It was in August, and we were camping at a place known as Cold Springs. After we'd camped there one day, the defendant, Walter David, arrived on horseback. David and Cox then got in some kind of an argument and a fight started. They fought furiously. David's face began to bleed and was soon all covered with blood, which was running from the deep scratches. The scratches had been made all over David's face on his right cheek, near his nose, and beside his left eye. The blood ran all over his clothes. After the fight was over, David left our camp, but the next day he returned, and I noticed that the blood had been washed off his face so we could distinctly see about 8 or 10 deep scratches. David and Cox then talked over the fight, and they agreed to shake hands and to say nothing about it. So I asked him how he could explain about the scratches, and he said he could tell anyone who asked him that a horse threw him off as he was breaking it. The defense attorney, to clinch the testimony, then asked Sutherland if the scratches on David's face were the same as those inflicted by Cox. "Well, I'm satisfied they are," Sutherland answered. Griesbach next took the witness stand. "Well, Cox scratched David up pretty bad," Griesbach testified. "Cox did it with his fingers like a wildcat would, and the next day David's face looked like a war map with the scratches running every way. But they both agreed to shake hands, and David said he would say he was thrown from a horse into the brush to account for the scratches." Was David's alibi logical? Could Ryan present a similar explanation to account for the great amount of blood on his coat? "Well, my horse tossed me off by suddenly rearing when I was riding in the trail," said Ryan. "I got a deep cut over my eye, and it bled a lot. The only thing I could do was wipe the blood off on my coat sleeve. I got covered in the blood. But how? The district attorney asked him. How do you account for the broken needle in the lapel of your coat and the shells from your gun found near the grave of Carmen Wagner? I was near where the girl's body was later found hunting deer, Ryan replied. I saw an animal on the hillside and I started to shoot at it. It was running up the hill and I fired several shots at the animal, about 18 in all, before I hit and killed it. Then I lifted the deer's carcass and got some more blood on my coat. I probably broke that needle by lifting the deer. With the evidence and the two men's alibis before him, the judge pondered the case deeply. The responsibility rested on his shoulders. Everyone waited anxiously for his official ruling. "It is ordered by the court," said Justice of the Peace Fraser, "that Walter David be discharged and that Jack Ryan be held to answer on charges of murder." David walked from the courtroom a free man, but never, in the wildest stretch of the imagination, could he possibly have foreseen the horrible fate which was soon to overtake him. Meanwhile, Ryan prepared for his trial, which began February 17, 1926, 4 months after Carmen Wagner and Henry Sweet had been murdered. The trial was to be fought bitterly over a period of 6 weeks. One of the DA's witnesses was W.R. Shields, a rancher who had resided in Humboldt County for many years and who was believed to have been the last man to see Carmen Wagner alive, except, of course, her slayer or slayers. Under my direct examination on the witness stand, Shields testified substantially as follows. On the 9th day of October, which was 2 days after Carmen Wagner had left her home in Eureka to go hunting with Henry Sweet, I was in the vicinity of Coyote Flat, said Shields. I remember seeing Carmen Wagner that day about 1.5 or 2 miles from Coyote Flat on what is known as Hind Palm Trail on the top of the ridge. I spoke to her as I met her on the trail. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning. My wife and I were camping at Government Springs within 3/4 of a mile from where I met Miss Wagner. Shortly after we saw Miss Wagner, we saw someone else in the same country. Who was this mysterious man? Was he the slayer or one of the killers who killed Carmen Wagner and Henry Sweet so ruthlessly? The mystery man was seen by Shields near an old unfinished cabin some 200 yards from Government Springs. I was standing on the trail when I first saw the man who was right behind the old cabin by a rock, Shields testified. The man was not a very large man, although I could not see his entire person. He was wearing blue overalls and of some kind of wool or a khaki shirt of bluish or greenish color. The man was then standing on the top of the rock by the old cabin. Just 45 minutes before he saw the strange man, Shields said he'd seen Carmen and her collie dog on the trail, and the sinister-looking man had gazed after the girl as she walked along the trail. Then he vanished. Later that same day, Shields said he'd discovered tracks of 2 men who'd traveled along the same path where Miss Wagner had been walking. 2 days later, Shields said he'd learned of the murder of Henry Sweet, who'd been shot to death in front of the little shack at Coyote Flat by the slayer or slayers who hid behind the large rock which stood some distance away. Then, Shields joined the posse which began the search for Carmen Wagner. As Shields testified, the questions he answered brought out vague hints, but nothing more, as to the rumored sinister shrine for human sacrifice, which some persons believed they'd seen at Coyote Flat, where the girl's body had been buried after she was slain. Dr. Heinrichs, at the same time of his investigation into the killing of the girl, had expressed a theory that Carmen had been held as a sacrificial offering for a phallic religious ceremony planned at an Indian altar on the top of Coyote Flat. Was there anything at all to support this startling theory of a sacrificial offering of a beautiful young red-haired girl, a human being given to a strange deity like a goat slaughtered for blood sacrifice? The DA questioned Shields as to what he'd observed in the vicinity of the girl's grave. Well, there was a piece of bark lying on a tree stump, he answered. Right east of the stump in an easterly direction there was a log, and the bark had been taken from that log. Then, the place from where the bark had been removed, and a stick and the log lined up almost perfectly with the location of the girl's body. A fire had been built there in a small space which was only about 14 or 16 inches across. The ground was very hard with a few scattered leaves lying around, but by the tree there were the tracks of a horse opposite where the fire had been. In my judgment, the tracks had all been made by an unshod horse. Ryan previously had admitted that his colt was not shod. Shields then told of finding red hairs and white hairs from chaps near the scene of the murder. The hairs were found on the trail, on bushes, from a foot or so to 3 or 4 feet above the ground. The red hairs, the DA emphasized to the jury, were torn from the head of Carmen Wagner, while the white hairs were from Ryan's chaps as he dragged the girl along the trail to the place where she was shot to death and then buried. Answering the DA's questions, Shields then related how he'd helped to disarm young Walford when the boy ran from the posse camp with the avowed intention of getting Ryan. That boy acted to me like a man in a frenzy and about half crazy, said Shields. The boy testified, trying with apparent earnestness to be truthful about every detail, and told how he had searched for his missing friend Carmen. Then Walford related in detail how he had discovered the girl's missing wristwatch hidden in the chaps owned by Jack Ryan. Walford told the jury he believed Jack Ryan to be guilty of murdering Carmen. It seemed that the evidence was gradually accumulating against Ryan. The next witness for the prosecution was Dr. Heinrich. He related his tests which had been conducted with the bullet found in Miss Wagner's head and how its measurements coincided exactly with the riflings of bullets fired from the Luger pistol, which Ryan admitted was his weapon. Dr. Heinrich told in vivid detail of the bloodstains on Ryan's coat and emphasized his belief that blood flowing from a cut in the suspect's forehead could not possibly have found its way into the inner side of the man's pocket, where a stain was found on some cigarette papers. Dr. Heinrich said the blood on Ryan's coat was that of a human being and not of a deer, as Ryan had claimed. Bit by bit, the circumstantial evidence accumulated against Ryan. Would the evidence prove strong enough to convict the man of the fiendish murders and send him to the gallows or to prison for life? Or was Jack Ryan merely the victim of circumstances so strange that he only appeared to be the murderer of both Henry Sweet and Carmen Wagner? With an air of innocence, Ryan himself took the witness stand in a desperate effort to save his life. He was sworn in as a witness for himself before Superior Judge Denver Sevier. Could his testimony overcome the almost overwhelming weight of the evidence against him? We'll find out after the break. Hey everybody, we're back. Thank you for taking the time to support the brands that support Kinda Murdery. Oh man, we've got a whole bunch of shout-outs today, which is awesome. I gotta tell you, when you guys interact with me, it makes me feel so good. It makes me feel like I must be doing something right whenever I hear from you, even if I hear from you for something I did wrong. So thank you for reaching out to me, which, as you know, you can do at kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on all social media, including TikTok, where you can currently find a video of me petting my adorable bearded dragon, Lord Beardamus, so named because he has an incredible amount of pride and dignity. All right, on to our first shout out, which goes to Rich Karpinski from Mount Vernon, Ohio. And Rich, you will be getting some full color, kick-ass, vinyl, Kinda Murdery stickers. Everybody else, if you'd like to get some stickers too, remember, all you have to do is reach out to me, kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on social media. Give me your address, and I will send you stickers as well. And I will send you extras, and please do hand them out to people who you think might like the show. And stick them places that you think they might get seen, like the back of your car, a rest stop bathroom. You know, there's lots of options. Our next shout out goes to Wayne S. Pierce from New West Radio Productions, who reached out to say that he loves the show. I have to give another shout out to the awesome Ryan Downer, who I've shouted out before, who was kind enough to send me photos of his visit to the Mothman Festival in Monongahela, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, so if you live in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, please reach out and correct me. But yeah, it's a very picturesque town, and they have this kick-ass Mothman Festival every year, and Ryan went, and he sent me some pictures, and Ryan, more stickers are coming your way. Thank you for handing them out. All right, our next shout-out goes to Simeon Hunter from Indianapolis, Indiana, who reached out, as I requested, to correct me on my pronunciation of the town Terre Haute, Indiana, which, he kindly pointed out to me, is actually pronounced Terre Haute. He said a lot of Indianans just call it terrible horrible because it's such a crap hole. I've never been there myself. Hopefully no one from Terre Haute is listening, or maybe you agree with Simeon, but thank you as always for correcting me. And Simeon also left this fantastic review, which I would love to share with you. He said, I've been listening to Kinda Murdery for a while now, and it's always intriguing. The research done is second to none, and it's not the same stories literally everyone else is covering. I highly recommend it. Man, that is so kind of you to say. Thank you so much, Simeon. You are also getting stickers. All right, moving on. I'd like to mention, as I always do, that there is a free 3-digit number, 988, that you can dial to receive suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, or mental health counseling, should you need it. Please program that number into your phone. And if you are in acute crisis, do call it. Someone who cares and is there for you will pick up immediately. If you're not in immediate crisis, but you'd still like to make a connection, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, kindofmurdery@gmail.com or at kindofmurdery on all social media. I'm here. I care. I'd love to connect with you. And please remember that you are loved and the world is a better place with you in it. Also, as you know, I have cerebral palsy and I would like our community to be especially supportive for people with disabilities. If you or someone you love has a disability and would like to share their story or would just like to connect to someone else and talk about their experience living with those challenges, please do reach out to the show. Again, kindofmurdery@gmail.com or at kindofmurdery on all social media. If you'd like me to share your story with everybody, I will, or we can just keep it between us. Oh, and one more thing, guys, and I don't know quite yet exactly when this episode is going to come out, but I have to tell you because I'm so excited. This week, I get to interview none other than New York Times bestselling author Richard Kadrey, the author of the Sandman Slim books. I don't know if you're familiar with Richard's work, but it's phenomenal. It's hard-boiled. It's hilarious. It's violent. It's visceral. It's absolutely kind of murdery. It's urban fantasy, almost like a detective novel, but set in a world full of angels and demons and monsters. And Sandman Slim is a half-human, half-angel who's escaped from hell to wreak vengeance on his enemies. I absolutely love this series. I love all of Richard's writing. By the way, he also writes Lucifer for DC Comics. I eagerly await everything he publishes, and I am just absolutely fanboying out that I get to interview him this week. So if you're a fan of Sandman Slim, or if you just want to hear what an absolutely phenomenal artist has to say about the great work that they do, look out for Kinda Murdery with Richard Kadrey, best-selling author of Sandman Slim and Lucifer Comics, published by DC. All right, with that, let's get back to the thrilling finale of Who Killed Carmen Wagner. This time I'm not going to rewind the story. I'm just going to remind you that we're about to hear the first-person testimony of accused murderer Jack Ryan. Kinda Murdery resumes now. What follows is the sworn testimony of Jack Ryan, accused murderer of Carmen Wagner. "My name is Jack Ryan," began the accused man. "I am 23 years old, and before my arrest, I lived at Maple Creek with my mother." Okay, Zevin jumping in here. When I found this story, it blew my mind that Jack Ryan grew up in Maple Creek. That is where I'm from. It is a place in Humboldt County that's behind 14 miles of gravel road, basically one-lane gravel road like Costa Rica, a couple more miles of dirt road, and there are no stores there, no gas stations. There's a school and there are some homes, but it is really, really in the middle of nowhere, far northern California. I grew up an hour from the nearest town, off the power grid, all wood heating, wood cooking, solar and water power. If you've never lived that rural, you wouldn't believe it. Didn't have internet, none of that. Didn't even, like I said, have power. And even today, there's hardly anybody out there. So to stumble across a story where one of the central characters, the accused murderer no less, was from my little wooded island, speaking metaphorically, of course, of the world, Maple Creek, California, just kind of blew my mind. Although it is true that in the 20s, when the logging and timber business was really booming, there were a lot more people out there. There was a mill out there. There was more to it in Jack Ryan's day, but still, it's incredible. All right, sorry, let's get back to the story. "My name is Jack Ryan. I am 23 years old, and before my arrest, I lived at Maple Creek with my mother. I worked at various places in Humboldt County. Previous to the 10th of October, I worked about 3.5 days at Deer Creek. I was cutting weeds. I began this work on Monday evening, October 5th. I worked half a day Tuesday, all day Wednesday and Thursday and Friday." Ryan talked crisply and answered quickly the questions put to him by his attorney. The jury paid strict attention to the witness, and the crowded courtroom also listened attentively. Was the accused man telling the truth, or would he attempt to lie about his whereabouts at the time Sweet and Carmen were believed to have been slain? The jury was to decide. The clear answers might be the result of Ryan having drilled himself as to the dates and places to establish an unimpeachable alibi, or the direct, frank answers might mean that he was telling nothing but the truth. "Have you ever made any moonshine liquor?" Ryan's attorney asked. "No, I never did," Ryan answered frankly. "Do you know how to make it?" "No, I don't know anything about it." "Now, when you're not working, where do you usually spend your time?" "At my mother's house at Maple Creek." "Now, going back to the 10th of October, the day Carmen Wagner is believed to have been murdered, what time did you leave Deer Creek Ranch that morning?" "At about 7:30 past." "And what horse were you riding?" "I was riding a roan. I bought the horse on September 7th, and from then until October 10th, I'd ridden the animal about 3 weeks steady. But on October 10th, the horse was only about half broken to the saddle. When I left that morning, I was going up to my brother's to see about trading horses. When I started out, the horse was feeling pretty good and frisky, and when I was running him down a road by the river, he fell. There was something in the road, and he kind of stumbled and fell. He threw me off, and I got a bad cut on my forehead. It bled a little bit, and when I came to the river, I washed the blood off. Then I got back on the horse and rode on the trail up to the old Wagner place. Meanwhile, my forehead continued to bleed. I never tied any cloth around it, but I wiped off the blood a couple times on my coat sleeve." "Was there any brush along that trail that you had to dodge under to get through?" the defense asked Ryan. "Yes, sir," he answered. "There is brush upon the trail that a fellow has to go under to get through." How could Ryan account for the heavy stains of blood found in his right coat pocket? "Did you get your hands sore while you were working at pulling weeds?" the defense lawyer asked Ryan. "Well, yes, I got sore hands, and I bought a bottle of iodine. I put the bottle in my right coat pocket, and later the bottle was broken and it stained my cigarettes," Ryan said in a straightforward voice. Ryan then related how he had continued to ride past the trail leading to the Wagner place and on to Showers Rock, where he tied his horse to a low bush and went hunting. He shot at a deer several times, he said, finally killing the fleet-footed animal as it ran swiftly on the slope of the hill. The 2 Luger shells found near Carmen's body might have ejected from his gun when he passed the spot, shooting at the deer. So now all of a sudden, Zevin interjecting here, he's hunting deer with a 9mm German handgun. Okay, back to the story. When he lifted the deer carcass to his saddle, Ryan said blood flowed onto his coat, and the pressure from handling the 3-point animal might have broken the needle in his right coat lapel. Ryan vigorously denied any knowledge of the double murder and claimed that if Carmen Wagner's wristwatch had been found in his chaps, the timepiece must have been planted there by some person who hated him bitterly and wished to see him accused of the brutal slayings. So, of course, now here it seems that Ryan is indirectly accusing Walford not only of framing him, but probably of being the murderer, since how else would Kenneth Walford have gotten his hands on Carmen's watch? Back to Ryan's testimony. "I first heard of the death of Henry Sweet on October 13th, said Ryan. "On the 19th, I remember meeting Kenneth Walford on the trail. He asked me if I was acquainted with the country, and I told him that I used to live up there. Then he asked me about some cabin in the canyon, and I told him there was a cabin down there someplace." Now, the DA questioned Ryan about the mysterious movement of his hand to his chaps, which had seemed strange to Walford. "It was merely a motion of my hand to get some cigarettes in my pocket," replied the defendant. Walford, it will be remembered, intimated that Ryan had made a motion as though to conceal something in his chaps. Ryan then told how the officers had arrested him late at night after the murdered girl's body had been found. "I'd gone to bed about 9 o'clock, Ryan testified. "I fell asleep and was awakened about 10 o'clock when the officers arrived. They asked me to get up, saying they'd come from the sheriff's office for me. I got up and I dressed, and they put handcuffs on me. The officers told me that they'd found out I'd killed the girl and the dog and said they'd seen where I'd buried the girl, and they told me to come through with everything. I told them then I don't know anything about it. Then, about an hour later, still wearing the handcuffs, I mounted my horse and we all rode to the jail at Eureka." The DA hammered the man's testimony, trying to shake it. He brought out that although Ryan was regarded as one of the best horsemen in the country, he still wanted to get rid of the colt which he claimed had thrown him and cut his forehead. Ryan was also regarded as a good pistol shot. "Ryan," asked the DA, "how many shots did you fire at the deer you killed?" "Between 15 and 18 shots, he answered. "At the same deer?" the DA asked incredulously. "How many shells will your Luger hold?" 9 shells, said Ryan. "I fired a full clip at the deer, which was running on the hillside, but I missed it and had to slip in another clip of cartridges. I finally got the deer." Wow, I'm surprised he didn't claim to have hit the deer at least once with that first clip to explain how in the heck it didn't get away. Tons of California white-tailed deer out in Maple Creek, up where I'm from, where all this happened, and let me tell you, Those animals are faster than Olympic sprinters and can jump way higher than professional basketball players. So the idea that he emptied an entire clip, then had time to reload, and in that entire time, the deer neither removed itself from sight nor got far enough away to make the pistol ineffective, begs some belief. But hey, I'm not on the jury. So here we go. 9 shells, said Ryan. I fired a full clip at the deer, which was running up the side of the hill, but I missed it and had to slip in another clip. I finally got the deer. The DA fired question after question at Ryan in an attempt to upset his testimony as to the various places he claims to have been at the time Sweet and Miss Wagner were slain, and during the time of the hunt for the girl after the body of her companion had been found. The jury paid strict attention to each bit of testimony, for and against the accused man. Finally, all the evidence had been presented. At once, the defense attorney made a motion to Judge Sevier for a directed verdict of acquittal for Ryan on the ground that the evidence was not sufficient to establish that the defendant had committed the murders. The motion was denied. The DA began his argument, his final argument, to the jury. He said that the evidence, although admittedly circumstantial, was so strong as to the point of conclusive guilt for Ryan. He asked the jury to find the defendant guilty with punishment severe enough to suit the fiendish crimes with which Ryan was charged. The long and bitterly fought trial had lasted about 6 weeks, and the jury was given the case at 5 o'clock on the afternoon of March 11, 1926. After Judge Sevier had instructed the jury as to the degrees of guilt in the case, or a verdict of innocence, the jurors retired to begin their deliberations. And here, we're going to hear from the DA in first person. Picture my feelings, he says. I had presented every bit of evidence I could obtain against Ryan, for I believed the man to be guilty of the 2 foul crimes. The defense had fought equally hard as to establish the innocence of Ryan or to instill a reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors as to the defendant's guilt. After electing a foreman, the jurors deliberated solemnly until 10 o'clock at night. At that time, no verdict had been reached, and the jurors were locked up for the night. I retired to my home, confident that the verdict would be against the defendant. The next morning, the jurors went to breakfast, and then they returned to the jury hall to resume their deliberations. Half an hour later, a court bailiff was summoned hastily. The jury had reached a verdict. The foreman stood up, hesitated perceptibly with the apparent responsibility of delivering the verdict, and then he cleared his throat with a sound audible throughout the room and began to speak. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jack Ryan, not guilty. A stunned silence swept over the courtroom. No one spoke a word, nor was there any demonstration of any kind, either favorable or against Ryan. Then, excited whispers swept through the audience as the unexpected verdict was discussed. Outside the courtroom, when Ryan walked forth a free man, an entirely different scene took place. Many women swarmed around Ryan, and it was reported some of them offered him work for the coming summer as a guide. And now it's the DA speaking again here. Of course, my astonishment was so great at the verdict that I could hardly find words to express my amazement. And Judge Sevier, who had weighed every bit of the evidence as it was offered, remarked to me quietly outside the courtroom regarding the reaction to the acquittal of Ryan. Said the judge, I'm astounded at this verdict. Automatically, the case had reverted to the status it was before anyone had been arrested for the murders of Henry Sweet and Carmen Wagner. Were the murderers to go unpunished? Had the guilty persons escaped and fled from the country while the officers in District Attorney's office were gathering evidence against Walter David and Jack Ryan? Were the trails of the real murderers so cold as to be untraceable? Would justice be cheated? Dun dun dun. Sorry, couldn't help it. After David had been discharged at his preliminary hearing and Ryan had been acquitted at his trial for murder, the 2 half-brothers returned to their regular existences of working odd jobs for persons in Humboldt County. Some 8 months later, District Attorney Arthur Hill, who had served from 1913 through 1926, retired to his private practice as an attorney of Eureka. He disliked greatly to have the word unsolved written on the records beside the murders of Henry Sweet and Carmen Wagner, but held a cherished hope that time would aid the law in bringing the guilty persons to justice. There is a saying, murder will out, and he hoped that that would prove true in the case of the murder of young, beautiful Carmen Wagner. The DA turned all the records and evidence of the Sweet Wagner cases over to his successor in the office, District Attorney S.E. Metzler. Time passed, and gradually the 2 fiendish crimes became but horrid memories to the citizens of Humboldt County. But the murderers were always in the minds of the officers. Then, after a year and 8 months had gone by, the country was shocked by another horrible crime. On November 1st, 1927, Ernest Porter, a ranch foreman, was traveling along a trail near Coyote Flat when his attention was attracted to the huddled form of a man lying in some dense bushes. The still, silent form at once showed Porter that the unknown man was dead. Hurriedly, Porter summoned the officers at Eureka, and Jack Runner, now sheriff of the county, arrived at the scene. He at once turned the body over and gazed with horror at the dead face of Walter David, none other than the half-brother of accused murderer, Jack Ryan. David had been dead for many days. He had been cruelly choked to death by a cowboy's lariat which had been tightened around his neck. Sheriff Runner reconstructed the crime from the trampled bushes and marks of a rope on the limb of a nearby tree. An assassin had watched David as he rode over the trail through the mountains. As David's horse passed near a tree, the assassin, lurking hidden in the bushes, had twirled his lariat over his head and swung the rope in twisting circles toward David. The rope circled over David's head, tightened around his neck, and the bloodthirsty assassin jerked his victim from his horse and dragged him along the trail for several yards to an oak tree. Here, the killer threw his lariat over a strong limb and dragged the struggling David off the ground. The mysterious and merciless assassin hanged David by the neck until he was dead. When David's struggles ceased and his face became black from the strangling, the assassin lowered his victim to the ground and removed the rope from around his neck. Then, the killer escaped. Broken ferns and bushes beside the trail showed clearly how David had been dragged to the tree where he was hanged. Then his assassin had thrown his corpse into the dense bushes. There were no knife or bullet wounds on the victim's body. A medical examination disclosed that he'd been choked to death by the rope and the vertebrae in his back were stretched apart from the violence with which the assassin had yanked him off the ground. One front tooth found near the body had been knocked from David's mouth as though the slayer had struck him a heavy blow in anger. Several drops of blood were found on David's hat from the sear caused by the knot in the rope as it was tightened around his neck. So who killed Walter David? Was he slain so viciously because the murderer feared that he knew too much and had threatened to reveal his hideous secrets? After David's murder, 3 crimes were marked against the unknown fiend or fiends who were also believed responsible for the murders of Miss Wagner and Henry Sweet. But more than 10 months passed without the authorities being able to find the solution to the perplexing murder puzzle. During this time, the sinister figure, the murderer of Walter David and, presumably, of Carmen Wagner and Henry Sweet, walked the streets unmolested with taunting bravado. Then, he began a series of other brutal crimes. In succession, he attacked several girls during the first part of September 1928. The officers set a trap for the criminal, and cunning though he was, he walked unsuspectingly into the net. A merciless grilling followed at the hands of District Attorney Metzler, and finally the suspect weakened. Confronted by the young girl victims whom he'd attacked, the suspect offered to plead guilty to charges of criminal assault on 2 of the girls. The penalty in California for such a crime by force is 1 to 50 years in the state penitentiary. The suspect was sentenced to San Quentin, but instead of having the prisoner taken immediately to the penitentiary, Metzler determined to submit him to further questioning. The grilling began at 7 o'clock on the evening of Wednesday and continued without let-up throughout the night, the officers working in relays and firing a broadside of questions at the suspect. D.A. Metzler made sensational accusation after accusation against the suspect. His dark eyes glowered in anger. The suspect replied to the questions in a surly tone. He admitted he was guilty of the attacks on the young girls, but of any other crimes he knew nothing. Jim Sage, a deputy sheriff, aided Metzler in the grilling, and as dawn broke over the jail, the suspect said he wanted to talk to the deputy alone. Metzler readily consented and at once left the room. A moment later, Sage called to Metzler and asked for a paper and pen. The suspect, sobbing bitterly, then broke down and signed his name to a confession startling in its cold and ruthless brutality. So horrible were the facts in the confession that the district attorney Metzler himself broke down and wept. "You knew all the time," cried the suspect in a sobbing, choking voice as he gazed through tear-stained eyes at the DA. Hurriedly, other officers in the jail were summoned to act as witnesses to the signed confession. They grouped about the suspect as he signed the paper. The confession was brief, less than 200 words in length. Word for word it read, "To whom it may concern, on October 10th, 1925, I was on my way from Deer Creek to Walter David's cabin. I met Henry Sweet on the trail. I asked him for some money that he owed me for whiskey. He told me that if I wanted it, I had to take it out of his hide. Then we went to Sweet's camp and had some hot words. Sweet had a pistol on him. He said he would get me. I worked around till I got his rifle, then I shot him in the side. The girl, Carmen Wagner, came in when I was ready to leave. I told her to keep right on going. I took her gun away from her and put it behind the fence where it was found. Then I took her along down the ridge to the canyon. Then she wouldn't go any further. She said she was going to go back to town and tell the officers. Then I forced her down into the canyon and I shot her and the dog. Then I went on and ran across some hogs and hunted them for a while. From there, I went down to the old Fort Baker barn and stayed there all night. In the morning, I went to David's and traded horses. The next day, I went hunting. Then I went down in the canyon and buried the girl. The confession was signed by Jack Ryan. Wow, that's heavy. He killed his own brother and then went right back to assaulting women. You know what the grand irony is? There's a law called double jeopardy, which says that you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. Who knows why Jack Ryan killed his half-brother Walter David? Perhaps David threatened to expose him as the murderer of Carmen Wagner and Henry Sweet, but Jack Ryan had already been found innocent in a court of law for that exact crime. So he may not have known this, but even if Walter David came forward and said, my brother Jack Ryan is the killer, and even if they found more evidence that was not circumstantial, that was entirely conclusive, Jack Ryan, under double jeopardy, still could not have been retried or convicted or punished for the specific crime of killing Carmen Wagner and Henry Sweet. Of course, once he murdered his brother and assaulted other women, then of course, he can be tried for those crimes. But had he not killed his brother, had he not assaulted other women, and if it was the fear of exposure that caused him to kill his brother, he need not have feared that, at least not in terms of consequences from the law, whether he may have been lynched by the citizenry or in other acute physical danger. Certainly, the fact that he was half Native American in those times would have played a significant role as well. Who's to say? But he could not have been found guilty for that specific crime. Is it at all possible that the sheriff and his deputies beat a confession to the Carmen Wagner and Henry Sweet murder out of Jack Ryan so that they could close a case that they knew at this point they would never solve? I don't think so. I think he did it all. Why else would he kill his own brother? Although he didn't confess to that one. I'll see you on Sunday, September 25th, as we begin a brand new Kinda Murdery mystery. Until then, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers. Leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.